like everywhere in the world, apart from the usual schemes of various world empires, in the 19th century Romanian history was marked by various movements and revolts started by secret societies such as the Freemasons, or by ordinary people, in an era where nationalism was growing in Europe. Throughout history, instead of solving Russia's poverty and backwardness problems, the Russian leaders were always more interested in quote-unquote, liberating smaller states and exporting the Russian poverty and backwardness to them. The 19th century began for Romania with such a liberation. In 1812 the Russians declare that Moldova belongs to them and attempt to annex it for good, but because of the threat of Napoleon's invasion only managed to occupy the eastern part of Moldova, which is today in Ukraine and the state of Moldova. This was part of a larger plan to dominate the entire Balkan region, including the Romanian states Wallachia and Moldova, which were then vassals of the Ottoman Empire. The Romanian language always stood in the way of Russia and its attempts at stretching its empire across the Slavic world into the Balkans. The annexation of entire Moldova was agreed on by Napoleon and Tsar Alexander I before their relations went sour. As soon as they got their hands on Romanian lands, the Russians would always try to turn the land into a Russian-speaking territory by all means possible. Until today Russia continued to try and extirpate the Romanian language from Moldova, including by deporting and assassinating hundreds of thousands of Romanians and colonizing Russian speakers in their place. All of the 12 quote-unquote liberations of Romanian lands by the Russians would be marked by violence, robbery and pillage, theft, rapes and murders, and the 1812 episode was no exception. The first Romanian Revolution of the 19th century took place in Wallachia in 1821. In that time the Ottoman Empire would sell the throne of Wallachia to rich Greeks from Constantinople. These Greeks would in turn try to get as rich as possible in the shortest time while on the throne of Wallachia. For the Romanian people this meant excessive taxation, no interest from the ruler in the improvement of the Romanian economy and society, rampant corruption, etc. In 1816 the French consul to Bucharest wrote that the peasants were waiting for a revolution to start, while the British consul wrote in a report that quote, "There is no people in the world that is more oppressed than the one of Wallachia and Moldova." This is the context in which Tudor Vladimirescu, a distinguished Romanian soldier of the Russian-Ottoman Wars, started his revolt of 1821. The peasants immediately answered his call, including thousands of Transylvanian Romanians who crossed the mountains to join his army, expecting the revolution to cross into Transylvania soon after. This movement for the national liberation of the Romanian people took place in an era when the entire Balkans were experiencing similar national revivals. Initially Tudor Vladimirescu allied himself with the Istoria movement, a Greek secret society born in Russia, which officially fought for the revival of the entire Balkan peninsula. These Greeks would betray the Romanians and assassinate Tudor Vladimirescu. Even though the Romanian Revolution failed because of this betrayal, its goals would partially be achieved when the Ottomans would abolish the old system and stop selling the throne to Greeks and place Romanians on it instead. In 1848 the European Freemasonry started a series of revolutions all across Europe, to advance their old plan of abolishing monarchies and implementing quote-unquote democracies, to better control people. The Romanian idealistic Freemasons started a movement in Wallachia and Moldova as well, asking for various rights and a union between these two Romanian states. The Ottoman and the Russian empires intervened and crushed the revolution. In Transylvania, as we have described in episode 8 of this series, the chauvinistic Hungarian speakers started an unprovoked genocide against Romanians, which caused the Romanian peasants to rise up to defend their lives. The goals of the Hungarian speakers, which were a minority both in mainland Hungary and in Transylvania at that time, were to assimilate every other nation and for the first time in history create a state where Hungarian speakers would be in a majority. In the case of Romanians, the assimilation would be done through the slaughtering of tens of thousands of innocent men, women and children, the erasing of hundreds of villages from the face of the earth, and the destruction of over 100 Romanian churches. The Romanian peasants were led by Avram Iancu, who was coming from a family of Romanian serfs, and so his main goal was the abolition of serfdom and the liberation of the Romanian majority of Transylvania from slavery. He crushed the army of the Hungarian speakers and basically ended their chauvinistic movement and along with it the genocide perpetrated by them. The 1848 revolution made little change in Transylvania, where the chauvinistic Hungarian speakers would eventually get to power by blackmailing the Austrian Empire in 1867 and start the famous assimilation campaign which gave birth to the modern Hungarian nation, as we have described in Part 8 of this series. In Moldova and Wallachia, however, the nationalistic movement continued, and after 10 years the two countries were united when Alexandru Ionuț was elected king of both countries in 1859, in spite of the opposition of the British, Austrian and Ottoman empires. But the country was still under the domination of the Ottoman Empire and under the influence of every important country of Europe, from the Russian Empire to the British Empire, and especially the Austrians, who did not want their Romanian slaves from Transylvania to be free like those of Wallachia and Moldova. So logically the next step was to try and get independence from the Ottoman Empire. In 1877 the Russian Empire declared war to the Ottoman Empire, and Romania sided with the Russians and declared the independence of Romania and stopped paying tribute to the Ottomans. As usual, this was done in spite of the opposition of the world's empires, such as the British, although they were hostile to the Romanian cause. The Russian Empire asked for the help of the Romanian army soon after the beginning of the war, after they were crushed by the Ottomans at the Battle of Plevna. The Romanian army joined the Russians, and under the command of the Romanian king and generals, they conquered this heavily fortified location. After similarly intense fighting, a series of other victories against the Ottomans followed, all throughout today's Bulgaria. This weakened the Ottoman Empire and allowed many other Balkan countries to gain their freedom, and in 1878 forced the world's empires to recognize the complete independence of Romania. As usual, the Russians did not respect the promises made before the war, and they permanently occupied Bujak, a small part of Moldova, which is today in Ukraine. In turn, Russia was forced to cede Dobruja, which was also inhabited mostly by Romanians. The Romanian victories against the Ottoman army allowed for the formation of an autonomous province of Bulgaria. After first asking for a union with Romania in 1886, the Bulgarians who led the movement, after being housed and supported by Bucharest throughout the late 19th century, quickly forgot this help and turned on Romania in the early 20th century to try and take more land from Romania, the pretext being a few families of Bulgarian speakers that lived in Dobruja. This conflict would end by an exchange of populations in that small area. The remaining Romanian population would be aggressively assimilated, and today there are almost no Romanian speakers left in Bulgaria. The majority of Bulgarian speakers today are descendant of Latin-speaking Thracians that have been assimilated throughout the ages. Just like in Hungary, the history of Bulgaria was grossly falsified, first by the Bulgarians of the 19th century, to justify their claim for the territory of Dobruja in order to control the mouths of the river Danube, and later by the communist historians at the orders of the USSR. We find a similar situation everywhere in Europe where Romanian speakers once lived in majorities, from Ukraine to Greece. For example, the Romanians from Serbia, although fought and died for the independence of Serbia in 1815 in their tens of thousands, were repaid by being violently forced to assimilate in the Serbian nation. The aggressive assimilation is still going on today in Serbia. Like in the case of Bulgaria and other Eastern European nations, a large part of Serbians are today descendants of Latin-speaking Thracians. As we have mentioned already, The vast majority of the Romanian political class of the 19th century was part of the Freemasonry. Most of them were idealistic Freemasons that did not see the long-term effects of the measures they were implementing in Romania at the advice of Western Freemasonry and were simply fighting for the good of Romania. The first king of Romania after the Union of 1859 we mentioned earlier was also a Freemason. To this day it is still not clear why he entered into conflict with the rest of the Freemasonry, even going as far as burning one of their lodges, but what is known is that he was forced to abdicate after 7 years and sent into exile, even though he was one of the best leaders Romanians had in centuries. One of the controversial measures he took was to secularize the possessions of churches. The majority of this wealth belonged to churches from Greece which got them through donations from medieval Romanian leaders or during the Greek regimes which were in place until the 1821 revolution. The Greek quote-unquote Christians were furious and their church leaders went as far as attempting to assassinate the Romanian king in 1864. Other measures such as the fiscal and agrarian reforms he implemented hurt the financial interests of the local Greek and Romanian nobility. The plots to overthrow him continued and succeeded in 1866. To this day these events are shrouded in mystery. As soon as he was exiled, the Freemasons brought a poor German officer of the Prussian army to be placed on the throne. He arrived in Romania in 1866 carrying only a suitcase of personal belongings, with the only thing recommending him being his blood relation to the giant inbred family from which all of the European monarchies are coming from. Named Charles I, he fulfilled his role as a puppet and except for building palaces, gathering riches, and attending military parades, did not do anything for the Romanian people. He would die 48 years later when World War I just broke out, leaving the Romanian economy just as he found it. The Romanian army of World War I, for example, was forced to fight with the weapons of their grandfathers who fought in the 1877 Independence War. Not only that he did not do anything for Romanians except to collect their riches, but he also betrayed the Romanian people in 1907 when he massacred thousands of peasants who were asking for their human rights, and also at the dawn of World War I when he refused to enter in the war to protect the Romanians from Transylvania, as we'll see in this episode and the next. The rest of the monarchs that have occupied the throne of Romania after his death would be similar characters. Queen Marie, who followed him, was known to cheat on her husband any time and with anyone available. Charles II, who followed her, would be a buffoon that would abandon Romania to Hitler and Stalin in World War II and abdicate, leaving the throne to the last of this line of failures, Michael, the one whose reign would have disastrous consequences as we'll see in future videos. Today this family is back in Romania and through various measures managed to get their hands on palaces and riches and continued to live on the back of the Romanians without doing a day's work in return. The only one who seemed to take his role seriously was Ferdinand I. During his reign he remained as humble as possible and oversaw Romania reuniting with Transylvania and Moldova and experiencing the golden age of its existence. The 19th century also saw the massive entrance into Romania of Jews that were chased out of various neighboring countries such as Russia and the Austrian Empire. Just like the Bible says, the worldwide Jewish community is extremely diverse from all points of view. For our historical analysis we will only be concerned with only one way of distinguishing between Jews. We need to make a distinction between the Jews that actively try to influence the running of countries and the behavior of societies to advance their own agenda, and the rest of the Jews who are not concerned with such issues. Many theories have been advanced to explain the behavior of the first group of Jews, with the most important being that they are part of the Sabbatean sect which are using a large part of the rest of the Jews who follow the Talmud. What their motives are, is irrelevant for our discussion. The only thing we need to emphasize is that when talking about various Jews that attacked the interests of Romania, it is this sect we are talking about, along with the small army of Talmudic Jews which helped them for various reasons, and not about the entire Jewish community. As we will see in later episodes, this subgroup of the worldwide Jews would succeed in just a few decades where countless world empires and migratory hordes failed for thousands of years to destroy the Romanian nation. On the other hand, the average Jews would always respect Romania and some of them would risk their entire livelihoods to defend it, as we'll see later. Reading the media of the 19th and early 20th century, back then still free and not in the wrong hands, we see that the majority of the Romanian elite had a bad view of the Jews that were flooding Romania in that era. For example, the poet Vasile Alexandri wrote, quote, "Who are these invaders? The most exclusivist and religious fanatics of all nations, that want to turn the country into an Israelite property." The Church Patriarch Mian Christou said, quote, "The Jews have caused an epidemic of corruption and social unrest. They monopolize the press, which, with foreign help, flays all the spiritual treasures of the Romanians. To defend ourselves is a national and patriotic duty, not anti-Semitism." The poet Mihai Eminescu said, quote, "The Jews have introduced and exploited the vice of alcoholism in our villages. They mixed the drinks with poisonous substances, physically poisoning and morally corrupting our nation." The writer and historian Bogdan Petriciacu has said, quote, "Making a mockery out of the respect of others, the Jew gets fat using schemes that are forbidden by the law or disapproved by the people's consciousness, like usury, contraband and prostitution." The historian and statesman Nearly Augur said, quote, "The Jews are kicking us out of our own country. Realizing their power, they strangle us, and what's worse, they falsify our soul, they degrade our morality through the journalistic and literary opium." Philosopher Emil Cioran said, quote, "As humans, we cannot get close to the Jew, because the Jew is first a Jew and only then a human." Some of the people that raised their voice against the behavior of the Jews in Romania would pay the price, like scientist Nearly Polscu, who discovered insulin but who was denied the Nobel Prize for this groundbreaking discovery because of the Jewish lobby who wanted to punish him for raising his voice against the Jewish cabal in Romania and against the international Freemasonry which they controlled. He once wrote, quote, "Why was the Jew hated in turn by the Egyptians, Romans, Persians, Arabs, Turks, and the Christian nations? Because always and everywhere he is an unsociable being, an exclusivist. In reality the Jew is hated because he is the slave of theft and pride." As we will see, these views were not quote-unquote anti-Semitic, but were honest analyses based solely on the behavior of Jews. They were not isolated either. In Western Europe, from where the Jews were thrown out more than 100 times throughout history because of their behavior, the elites had the exact same opinions. Apart from the typical taking over of illegal activities such as those mentioned earlier and of legal ones such as banking, commerce and the media, there are two main ways through which the Jews hurt Romania in the 19th century. The first, as mentioned earlier, is because of the introduction of synthetic alcohol which, like everywhere it was introduced, left deep scars. The other is the taking over of agricultural land from peasants through usury. They would also rent land from Romanians and sublet it to poor peasants. Like this, in a very short time the Jews became the main landlords of Romania, helped by the international banking system which was at their disposal. In 1903, for example, the Jews came to own or sublet 45% of large properties of over 50 hectares in Romania, such as the Fisher Trust, which in 1904 owned 237,863 hectares of land incorporating 79 villages. Along with the taking over of the land came the right to impose various taxes on the peasants working it. The peasants had no capital, so they had to borrow money from the same Jews, which through usury would end up owning the peasants' property. Some of the taxes that Jewish landlords imposed were outrageous, like a tax for cattle to drink water from lakes, a tax on clay used for bricks, etc. The peasants who did not pay the landlords would be arrested, and an interest to the interest owed added to his debt. The peasants had to buy the goods they needed from the local shops, which were also owned by the same landlord, who had a preemptive right to open these in the villages on his property once he bought the land. All this time, the Jewish media in the West led a savage campaign of denigrating Romania to force it to give citizenship to the hundreds of thousands of Jews that flooded the country in the previous decades, so that they could buy land directly and not through a trust. The Jewish oppression of the Romanian peasants would lead to a revolt of the peasants in 1907, starting in a village of the Fisher property mentioned earlier. This village was ironically named Flamenzi, meaning the hungry ones. The revolt was against the Jewish landlords of the Fisher Trust and quickly spread to other villages of Romania controlled by other landlords. These villages were some of the most oppressed and were literally starving because of the Jewish exploitation, and did not have any place to go since everything in the area was owned by the Jews. The puppet King Charles I we mentioned earlier intervened, and 11,000 peasants were massacred.